in case it helps. It's just one of these nice chap in Taiwan. Here we go, Michael Charney. Okay, he says, hi, Didi. I'm not sure who is trying to organize a Facebook.
We are, Didi?
Yes. Are we live?
We are live.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Most excellent.
Okay, Mike, take it from here.
Okay, sorry everybody for the technical difficulty we had to move. So we're going to talk about China's impact on Hong Kong, Cambodia, and Myanmar, and by extension the broader region as a whole. And there's different ways that we can talk about it. I'm a historian. One of the ways that I look at it is how it's going to change the way that Asia as a whole has been organized. We're going to see a return to for example, there's a change in Chinese IR right now, and there's development of new theories which look back at the Middle Kingdom as an organizing principle for integration and prosperity and development in Asia, which puts China at the center and works against problematic chaos and that kind of thing from their point of view, and likes to see stable relations. So I think that there will be an increasing emphasis as we have China's continued growth, China's push for the One Belt, One Road, and so on, to an increasingly integrated Asia in which there's a turn away from actually, outside of China, there's a turn away from an emphasis on the state and on the nation, an increasing emphasis on ethnic particularism and so on, and stability that reaches out to smaller ethnic groups. A fragmentation of the nation, and an emphasis on smaller ethnic national units. With the hope that this will bring greater political stability and ensure continued economic integration. This goes hand in hand with China's view of itself as an evolving power increasingly on a regional scale and on an increasingly global scale, in which they're also reflecting on the insecurities they felt in the post-war period regarding their U.S. policies of containment and so on around their coasts. The U.S. positions under the Truman administration, when the U.S. defense perimeter was extended further west from the Aleutian Islands to Japan to the Philippines, and then to incorporate South Korea and Formosa, now Taiwan, and by indirectly with Indochina, there is this fear that this is the part of their vulnerability. And so as China grows in power, it's going to increasingly push its definition of what is our space increasingly outward, and a version of their own Chinese defense perimeter. And that means that they will become increasingly involved in places like, well, certainly with Taiwan, as we know, but South China Sea, various Southeast Asian states, beginning with the mainland first, and increasingly in Central Asia, in Mongolia, and so on, as they expand what they see, seeing themselves as the core and expanding out to include these outer peripheral areas. So we have these two big trends. On the one hand, we have China trying to push for stability, not good governance, but stable governance along its frontiers, at the same time that these frontiers and its zone of influence and what they define as our space keeps on expanding outwards. And this is bringing tensions, and I think that this is one of the reasons that we found that they have, on the one hand, they have not necessarily been against civilian governance, but they are not in favor of supporting popular outbursts of democratic will, and will, on the other hand, it's also why they don't necessarily, in the case of Myanmar, for example, they would prefer to work with the deposed Aung San Suu Kyi rather than with the military, but they're not going to do anything to unseat the military because they need that continuing stability, so they don't assume that no situation invites external intervention again as they continue to build up their our China idea of Asia with themselves at the center. So I think that what we're seeing right now in Cambodia and Hong Kong and Myanmar are the tensions that result from that, a shift away from globalization directed from the West to a new paradigm in Asia centered on an expanding China, and China trying to keep the rim of this expansion stable, at the same time trying not to lose control of that. Ultimately, what we'll see in the end is we'll see an Asia that is completely economically integrated around the Chinese economy, and we'll see different populations within Southeast Asia increasingly under either direct or informal domination from the People's Republic of China. So that is how I'd like to segue into this. Obviously, both of you have eyes closer to the ground in many of these places, but that's my big top-down view of what's happening. Maybe we could begin with you, Zarni, on how you see the role of China in Southeast Asian politics.
Mike, I would rather that Didi goes first.
Oh, that's fine too. Didi can go as well.
Yeah, because she is one of the essentially world's foremost scholars and researchers on China, and because the discussion is very much centered around the impact of China, we should basically let Didi explain China from the internal perspective. We need to understand how the Chinese Communist Party thinks. In my view.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Zarni. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it's a big topic, obviously, and thanks very much for that view, Mike. I was struck to hear you say that you think it will go as far as for Southeast Asia, big parts of Asia, to be completely economically integrated into China. Obviously, it will happen. What that means on a political level is probably still up for grabs. I think we haven't quite decided how no one's decided. We don't know yet how that's going to look like. And what I see then, of course, in Hong Kong, and then encroaching increasingly on Taiwan, is a real an absolute takeover of the Hong Kong system, such as it was. It was a very hybrid system, but it was a real system, and it was made by the people of Hong Kong. And of course, what we're seeing there is the impact, the arrival of the CCP on an open society, such as Hong Kong's was, however partial in some ways, on a political level, a formal political level. And then what you see is pretty much a car crash, actually. And that's what we're seeing in Hong Kong now. Large numbers of Democrats arrested. Essentially, I think that what we're seeing there is a purge. It's a political purge. It's very similar to other purges in history. This is, after all, the Communist Party that's doing it. And just today, in fact, we had the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, and other very senior officials talking about, the future reorganization of the legislature in Hong Kong by the Communist Party. It's coming from Beijing, from Xia Baolong, for example. And, the quote is, as long as you are patriotic, you can have any views. Or, for example, you can be anything you like as long as you are a patriot. Now, Beijing always defines what is a patriot. So that's Hong Kong. That's where things are at now. And essentially this reorganization in Hong Kong, which is still to come, believe it or not, we've had the state security law already, is going to affect the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, district councils, and the civil service. Xi Jinping likes to say that China doesn't pose a so-called revolutionary threat elsewhere. I beg to disagree. Now, I've written quite a lot, researched quite a lot on the traditional roots of what I think is going on with the CCP. It's definitely Leninist. It's clearly Maoist and Xiist. It's also, I think, a deeper centralizing dynastic phenomenon, if you like, has to do with power's concept of itself as it is in China. So there's a lot more to see. And I wonder also, how far this is going to go. We're talking about Southeast Asia here, but when I look at developments in Europe as well, we're starting to see the inflection point, I think, where the connectivity issues, the strategic issues in terms of grand strategy, we see continental Europe, and here I'm not including the UK or Ireland, obviously, for now, shifting towards this Eurasian landmass as a trading mass. And I think that people in Europe haven't yet understood what's going on. So I'll just leave it those few short comments and back to you guys.
Hey, Zerny.
Yeah, I should say this, as a preface. Many of us in Southeast Asia, um, you know, lived in or grew up in former European colonized societies, and our natural instinct is to dislike and distrust the West because we felt, and with a huge degree of justification, that our societies have been sucked dry and we've been turned into serfs essentially for the creation of the what you would call wealth in Europe on the Western civilization. And so our affinity naturally is the rise of alternative non-European powers. But with one caveat, we would like to see the rise of non-European powers with the humanistic egalitarian view. We don't want another colonial power with the skin color similar to ours. Yeah, and the you know around 2005, 2006, I had one evening drinks with the last British governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, in his home in Barnes. And a friend of mine was a junior the diplomat working under the Chris's commissionership in Brussels. And so three of us, and he was very positive about the growing wealth and opening of China, and he was even advising the younger the British diplomats to study China, and because he see China rise, he welcomed it. And but at 15 years on, what we are seeing is a radical seismic shift in the way China is experienced and accordingly viewed in Southeast Asia. And I'm sure Africans would share this perspective as well. Like people start using economic colonialism, Dr. Mahathir used that as well, and in Philippines and other places. But what we're seeing is a really tragic historic parallel, to have this Brodolian view. We have in 1905, as Mike and Didi would know, the Russo Japanese War, where over a few centuries, an Asian power, if there's such a term, beat the European Russian power. Or although Europe has been trying to be a part of Russia has been trying to be a part, trying to figure out whether it wants to be with Europe or it's a standalone civilization, right? And so between 1905 and 1935 or so, after the fall of the Korean kingdom and then the capture of Manchuria, a lot of formerly colonial societies and nationalist movements look to Japan. Yeah, and Japan also tried to entice the rest of Southeast Asia, as if Japan was going to lift all of us in Asia, right? This East Asia, or Asia for Asians, or prosperity Asians. But look what Japanese power turned out to be: imperialist, expansionist, exactly what exactly the path that China is traveling at this point. And so that's just an overview. And this is Michael, what you've always said, history doesn't repeat under the same conditions, but it rhymes. It's frightening to us. We were occupied by the fascist Japanese a short while, but devastated the rule devastated the Southeast Asian societies. And we were under the British colonial rule for over 120 years, right, across Southeast Asia. And now we are confronted with this, extremely powerful and one of the second wealthiest economies in the world knocking on our door. If you look at the Burmese, the social psychological landscape right now. The Burmese today, as a whole nation, are revolting against homegrown military dictatorship that has had a grip on our society for 60 years, almost 58 years. And rightly, the Burmese absolutely despise the Burmese generals. And the second most despised actor is Chinese Communist Party. And China is siding, yeah, with our oppressor on the ground. The Burmese are seething with rage every day. There are demonstrations outside the Chinese embassy in Yangon and consulate, and there are calls, coming from the grassroots communities to essentially excommunicate, not, not the Chinese people, yeah, not the locals who live there, but the Chinese corporations, the Chinese Communist Party representation in Yangon. And obviously, all of these things are unhelpful to anybody. Yeah, we cannot hate our neighbors either as a people or as a country. But at the same time, people are compelled to hate the enabler of their oppression. And China is playing an enabling role behind the Burmese military junta. And this junta has committed every single crime that is written in international law: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide against Rohingya, and crimes against humanity, and political repression against the mainstream political majoritarian Buddhist society, right? And so when the whole country of 53 million people rose up saying that we want a representative form of government, yeah, that's 53 million sending an unequivocal message to the junta, to the Chinese leadership, and to the world. Yeah? The Communist Party in China, CPC, called it, Wang Yi called it internal cabinet shuffle. I mean, what kind of planet did Wang Yi come from? He's a guy who was educated at LSE, yeah, a very influential person. There's another guy who's also, making similarly rubbish comments, unbefitting anyone educated at LSE or Oxford or anywhere in the world. CPC has thousands of Western educated PhDs and lawyers and everywhere. They have seen what representative governments in the West is, and yet I don't mind like what kind of system they run. It's not my business, yeah, to say what type of the domestic political system 1.5 billion Chinese people should have. It's their internal affair. They decide. That is truly their internal affair. Only in case of like Chinese persecution of Uyghur people did I stand up and speak out. Yeah, as a human rights activist, I cannot be selected. But with respect to my own fellow Burmese, 53 million, we have spoken out. We have decided what type of internal political system we want. And the Chinese Communist Party is siding with murderous, genocidal, economically predatory regime. And that is why the Chinese, I should say, not Chinese, not the people of Han or even other people. The Chinese Communist Party is extremely devastating in its foreign policy, in its interference in terms of economic rape of neighboring countries, particularly my own and Cambodia. I'll stop here, and then we'll you will.
Well, I can intersect. I mean, there are a lot of things. First of all, there's lies, in government, there's lies you tell the people and lies you tell yourself. And second, looking at not to justify what they're doing, but figure out why they are treating these countries the way they are, and why they really don't care in big picture what's happening. They just want to ensure that there's stability, is because that's not the way that they're looking at IR, and they're not looking at it from a Western standpoint, or not trying to de-emphasize the importance of states. The newest generation of Chinese IR specialists, like Zhao Tianying and people like that, they're thinking about like the Zhao dynasty, and they're thinking about Tiancha and harmony under heaven, and the One Belt One Road is dynamic equilibrium. So in their point of view, as Asia gets reconfigured and economically integrated and everything else, the interstate rivalries and problems like that, this will all evaporate, and everything will be guided, way for prosperity for all. So when they're looking, you have to think about when they're looking at their effects, because obviously it's impossible to deny these negative effects of what's happening. Do they think that's as important as what is in their mind the larger goal of this economically prosperous Asia ringed around China? And this is what all big powers do, right? So the U.S. expands very heavily, and in their minds, it's really great because they're expanding. It's good for everybody because they expand liberal democracy everywhere. Right, and liberal democratic states, or liberal democratic state theory, they're not going to go to war with each other. So it actually makes the world a more peaceful place. And sure, there are going to be hiccups and problems in their efforts to expand this, but they tend to look at the big picture. What's good for the big picture? Again, this doesn't justify what I'm saying. How they would justify it in their own minds. So, what is most expedient to them in Myanmar? Is it going with the forces that have control right now, like the Myanmar military, or would it have been better to go with Aung San Suu Kyi when she had control? In both cases, the answer is yes. What they can't afford is to have all the countries around Southeast Asia that are being penetrated economically and diplomatically dominated by, militarily dominated, and so on, by the PRC. And they're doing that in part because they need that leverage of cooperation from ASEAN to get control of the South China Sea and support them in those policies. They can't afford to have all these governments overthrown by democratic masses that then think for themselves and might oppose some of these policies. So anyway, pass this on to Dee Dee, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Aung San Suu Kyi, I mean, the problems there we know, and Zani's spoken eloquently about those. But I think that the fundamental distinction here, obviously, is between the nature of the power that the people on the streets in Myanmar are now calling for, like the freedom, if you like, of a different kind of government power, and the one currently offered to them by the generals. And I just wanted to, and that's such an obvious point, but I wanted to use it to point to a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, which was made on January the 12th, so approximately less than 3 weeks before this so-called internal reshuffle that Beijing saw take place in Myanmar on February the 1st. Of course, it was nothing of the sort. It was a coup. But, on the one hand, we had Wang Yi, the foreign minister, saying in this statement that what they wanted to do in the so-called China-Myanmar community is build a community with a shared destination of mankind, common future, or whatever you want to call this phrase. It's the Chinese has a few interpretations, and that they're hoping that, and it follows on to say, China hopes the construction of the China-Myanmar economic corridor will unfold on a full scale after the new government is formed to help Myanmar's development and revitalization, and also believes that the Myanmar military will provide further support in this regard. Now, this is really clear. And for his part, Min Aung Hlaing responded that Myanmar is very pleased to witness China's rising international status and influence. So less than 3 weeks later, there was a coup. Now, I think that nobody needs to sort of dispute what happened there. What does it mean, though? I mean, for China, I think the issue is indeed, in some respects, a cultural issue, but only in the sense that as long as the CCP harks back to this sort of Leninist dynastic form of governance, which is, in a sense, it's a pre-modern form of governance, I do believe, particularly obviously the dynastic aspect. But it's amazing how totalitarianism knows its kind and picks up with other totalitarian systems. There's this, kind of a creepy affinity there. Then juxtapose against that the vision of China as it could be, for example, in other Chinese communities. I'm thinking of Taiwan, obviously, complicated story too, but certainly very different today from what it is in the mainland China, and as in terms of being any terms of being a Chinese political community. Look at Hong Kong, again, very, very successful kind of self-governance mode for a while, and certainly the future was bright until we had this sort of attack from Beijing, if you like, to use it in a non-physical sense, of course, but still. So there you really have a question of, looking backwards or looking forwards. And I think that it's clear how this is so tied into ideas of culture and this battle for a more modern China, to move on from the feudal past, from the dynastic past, from the communist past even, or present, is a very old battle in China. It's started over 100 years ago. We are still seeing that history working itself out. How much will it affect the rest of the world before it finally does change in China? Because I think it is going to finally change in China. I don't think it's going to be soon necessarily, but I think that there is a certain logic to history. Hegel said it, Sun Yat-sen said it, the person who puts themselves against the tide of history, will find themselves losing. And the Chinese Communist Party likes to use that phrase against Westerners, against Democrats. But in fact, I think that they are the first people who are going to feel that one day. And that's, so I think, again, with Southeast Asia, I've done a lot of research into how Beijing influences and interferes and takes over communities overseas, Southeast Asia, Europe, the United States, and it's always the same set of tactics. It goes through various channels, government channels, political channels, business channels, economic channels. The point is that we know what these are, and there's a lot we can do to influence or even stop this process, but we need a huge amount more of political leadership, political will, and we also need to look really closely at our own societies and how the economy and how capitalism and how politics functions in our own societies. I'm thinking here of the so-called West, let's just call industrial democracies, whatever, in order to manage this process safely for everyone in the world. Because, very important to remember that the concept of a shared community of shared human destiny is one that is being put forward to replace the post-45 United Nations-led world order. And recently, Wang Yi, in fact, said that China plans to, quote, proactively reform global governance. So this is not something that just affects China or Southeast Asia, it affects everyone in the world. And it will do very, very soon in a way that people will really notice.
Yeah, Mike, can I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, because as you know, like around Tiananmen Square events in 1980, June the 14th, 1989, right? Like we had uprising 1 year prior to the Tiananmen Square events in Burma, and my roommate in California at the university was a Chinese scientist, and I learned a lot from him about the way CPC operates. But in those days, like the world's concern was internal repression. Just as the Berlin Wall was just about to come down the same year in November, right? And then, like a few years later, the Soviet Union peacefully dissolved itself. In those days, I remember as a young activist from Burma, our concern was that Lee Kuan Yew and a small city-state, that was gathering wealth and public relations capital, promoting the city-state as a model for the rest of Southeast Asia, right? And so even the tiny little city-state that's run like a family-run mafia by the Lee family, as everybody knows, we were quite threatened because Singapore was very capable. It has been capable of supplying the Burmese military with arms. Allows the Singapore to be the money laundering center. The drug kingpins and the corrupt Burmese generals go and launder money. Now all of that has shifted to places like Shanghai. Unconfirmed reports say may outline the coup leader's family and daughter. The daughter had induced labor in Shanghai, one of the top hospitals in Shanghai, while the whole country was rising up, because of material poverty and hunger for, representative form of government. And so we've got these, the poles that are equally damaging, within Singapore, within ASEAN, Southeast Asia. Singapore has been, rather negative social and political force. And today, top 3 investors in Burma that have been funneling, FDI into this massive corrupt and killing machine we call Tamadol. PLA dismantled some of its conglomerates because the CPC have built civilian corporations that they no longer have to rely on PLA to make money, right? But that's not the case in Burma. But Burma is regressing, right? So we've got 2 massive, military controlled conglomerates, that control essentially natural resource extracted industries, natural gas, oil, timber, and then most of these goods go to China overland. We've got this massive pipeline, twin pipeline, gas from offshore in the Bay of Bengal, in the Burmese waters, and then we've got oil pipeline that comes from the Sea of Arabia, from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other across Hormuz Straits, and all of these things go to Kunming. Yeah, so Burma, from the CPC's perspective, is essentially a vassal state. Yeah, and then Mike, you talk about the dynastic vision, going back to the
Zhou dynasty.
Pardon?
The Zhou dynasty.
Yes, and I think what we have is because the China is a focus of our attention, and how we as Burmese or other Cambodians have experienced. We've got in Cambodia they have Sihanouk Ville, the entire coastal port city turned into essentially Chinese economic colony and a casino vacation spot. But I think China is an extremely worrying phenomena. The population-wise, the largest population, but politically, we have in Beijing, this cross between the Soviet-style neo-totalitarian system infused with, pre-modern feudalistic, racist, dynastic, operations, and coupled with, if you ask the Uyghurs, sort of SS-style thinking. So what are they thinking? Building concentration camps and, calling it a vocational centers for education, re-education. This is in 1970s, Cultural Revolution period. This is 2020, and the Chinese communists have the gall to do what the Nazis have done, 70 years ago, and what the czars and others have done centuries ago, and we do not want to live in a new world order where China will be calling shots and shaping world governance. They are not governing; they are sucking the world dry everywhere they go.
There are 2 midterm issues. One that you should keep in mind, or maybe one is one we could have called it more immediate. But the thing is, on the one hand, the problem is not so much the PRC. We know what the PRC is going to do and why they're going to do, and they're acting like any other state. Not a good state, but they're acting like any other big state might in terms of politics regarding other countries' relations. The problem is Southeast Asian leaders who see out of the expansion of China an opportunity to leverage wealth from that, to turn the West and China against each other and leverage money from that. So Duterte looking at how much money can we get for the U.S. presence in the Philippines, 19 billion, and that's only because China is now this big threat, this kind of thing. The other problem is the lack of realization. They pay lip service to it, but the real weakness in Western democracies and the U.S. that wants to oppose the expansion of China, the real weakness in recognizing that the best defense against Chinese expansion is democracy, is genuine democracy. And so while they pay lip service to supporting people in these various countries towards democracy, they don't actually do anything for a lot of the same reasons that China works the other way in terms of its expanding sphere. These are short-term sacrifices and a big goal. The problem is their big goal is very badly designed, because the only defense really, it's not more armaments in the West. It's not, greater military integration with the Quad. It's actually supporting genuine homegrown democracies at a popular level throughout the area. That's the only way to defend against this. We've seen in country after country in Southeast Asia, Laos is a great example of where the government, in exchange for investment from China, connections with China, will sell the whole region. Out, and that's what they've done with the Mekong. And that's Southeast Asian leaders who did that. Didi, did you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Regarding Cambodia, which we've spoken about a little bit less, so fascinating too. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I mention that because just across the road from where I lived as a kid was a long line of beautiful old colonial buildings, and guess who used to stay in them on his way to Beijing, because they were owned by the Bank of China, is Yang Sari and people like that. So basically, we always knew, and we always knew that that's what was going on. It's like Cambodia, Beijing. Of course, Sihanouk himself was in Beijing a lot. He had that beautiful house in the very old diplomatic quarter by Tiananmen Square. But Pol Pot and his crowd too, they were right in there. And we know about Mao's support for the killing fields in Cambodia, 2 million dead. That's never really been fully uncovered, I feel, at least in the consciousness, if you like, of the West. That's never really been completely acknowledged, whereas many problems that America has also engaged in and caused, in fact, have been quite thoroughly dissected and analyzed, which is good. But let's be honest, we tend to react to what we know and not to what we don't know, for obvious reasons. And there's a lot about the China influence in Southeast Asia that is very, quite old at this point, and that we simply don't have enough information about. Why don't we have enough information? Because we've got the same government in power in Beijing. And, even compared to what happens in Russia, for example, I mean, you just couldn't even begin to do in China what people have been doing recently in Moscow, for example. So it's just on a whole nother level of control. And so I think, on the issue of real democracy, Mike, that you mentioned, this is really interesting because, of course, are we looking in Burma now? Are we looking at something that could, and I hesitate to be so dramatic, if you like, but are we looking at something that could be an inflection point, in the sense that there are so many interests coming together here in Burma in a very raw kind of way? We are at a level of interconnectivity globally, where I know that that China may be helping them to shut down the internet, etc. I get that, but it's not complete. It's not. There's already stuff come out where these interests just collide, and people are going to start to realize that as China's rising, what is this new competition we're actually looking at, and is this going to somehow reorient, reshape, and redirect us to realize what's going on? I find that sort of an interesting thought. I don't want to sort of say that that's what's happening, in the sense that one can overstate things quite easily, but I really am truly wondering about that right now. I wonder what you guys think of that.
Zarni, do you want to go ahead, or do you want me to interject something?
I mean, maybe from a military's perspective, this would be quite interesting. This is something that is brewing. But as you know, the United States have the treaty with Taiwan Treaty, right? So the country, at least in theory, is obligated to defend Taiwan in the event of assault on Taiwan, the islands, the independence, if not recognized sovereignty, by the UN. But in the case of Burma, it's to me, it's a Wild West, Didi. It is a Wild West. I know a Indian ambassador who used to be based in Yangon, and he was a press secretary for the assassinated Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. And he told me in no certain term that he delivered a message, very stern message from India when China was beginning to expand its influence with the Burmese military. Look, like you're allowing the Chinese to build a radar station off the coast of Burma to monitor the Indian Ocean ship movements and whatnot. Of course, like the Burmese military profusely, denied it. But nonetheless, this ambassador, the Indian at the time, told me that his message, or his prime minister's message he delivered to head of the Burmese military intelligence was, you let the Chinese in, and then we'll come in from the Bay of Bengal, right? That is not a joke. Yeah, and because like China and India have had military confrontations. We don't know how many Chinese PLA soldiers have been killed, and we only know how many Indian soldiers have been killed. In Arunachal and all, this Tibetan, just below Tibetan plateau. And so I think this is definitely what do you call it? A very, very potential flashpoint in the future. And then I don't know if you know, like, we are in the second week of the Burmese military's naval exercises. In the Bay of Bengal, because the Burmese military fear that the bloody crackdown could be used as an excuse or pretext by the Seventh Fleet to come in. And so the Burmese military spokesperson, Brigadier Zominton, has been telling telling the country that they would fight fiercely. That's his words. Against any ship that enters the Burmese waters. I know, like, none of us think that the United States is going to militarily intervene, to create another Vietnam, in a country where China considers its vessel or strategic asset. And but the way paranoia works is that the Burmese military is pursuing what I think is a self-fulfilling path, because they are so paranoid about the U.S. military intervention. They will continue to make these paranoid moves, and at some point there will be a flashpoint there. That's my my view.
May I just ask a question here? I'm curious. Clearly, Cambodia, Hong Kong, certainly Hong Kong, Taiwan, very much in the Chinese area. Cambodia, Southeast Asia, but Myanmar clearly next to, you've got the Indian influence there. So, what will India's role or reaction be to the situation? We've talked about China, we've talked about the United States. India, hard to see India getting involved directly in Cambodia, for example, but certainly Myanmar's a different thing, or is it? I wonder what you guys think of that aspect.
Mike, you want to go?
Well, I would say one of the problems there, you have a colonial heritage. So Burma was part of India actually until 1937. So there was a lot of there was a big desire in the anti-colonial movement to separate from Indian domination. So and also the chasing out of much of the Indian population during the Japanese occupation. There are problems there, I think, with a more direct Indian role to play in Burma that will go back to this. The other aspect is there are a lot of geographical obstacles. The mountains in Assam, it's not quite as easy for India to interfere in Myanmar as it would be for China to interfere. I think the other big factor is that India and China are going to be a little bit wary about coming to conflict with each other after they just pulled away from the frontier just recently, where they had gotten in danger of war. So India will be conscious of that. What I was going to add to what you had been mentioning, your question you'd raised earlier about democracy. One of the things I think about a genuine democracy in Myanmar is it had to be different than anything they've had thus far, because when the military had power, they warmed up to China. When Aung San Suu Kyi was trying to outdo the military, she warmed up to China. In fact, she had spent a lot of time recently in the past couple of years warming up to China. Thein saying the same thing. So none of the government so far. And so I think you actually need a genuine democracy, popular democracy, that's built around democratic values instead of just majority control. You need to have transparency, which means much more developed and good governance. You need to have the probably the lack of corruption you have in Singapore, for example, but with a different take on what a popular democratic voice should be. If you could take maybe the democratic elections in Malaysia and combine them with lack of corruption in Singapore, you'd probably have the right kind of state you need to stand up to China.
I think that
Mike,
yeah.
Sorry, I think like what's really interesting is the the expansion of milk tea alliance, like Thailand, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And you will see a lot of Hong Kong Democrats and activists standing up with the Burmese, right? And what's so interesting is that, one thing that we don't talk about is we talk about like, how Southeast Asian states begin to coalesce around the Chinese interests because geographically, China has an advantage, and also it is its fastest growing economy in the world, right? And so, out of like self-interest, the self-reservations, the autocracies across Southeast Asia, find in China a natural ally at the detriment of their own long-term societal and people's developments. You see what I mean? So state interest in Southeast Asia is not the same as interest of the people as a whole. And so what we are seeing as activists on the grassroots is this coalescing of democratic struggles across, not just Southeast Asia, Far East and Southeast Asia. And we are looking at China as a major, major obstacle, the enabler behind autocracies, preservation of autocratic, murderous, corrupt regimes is made possible by China, and so there's a coalition, I think like for the enlightened Chinese Democrats in Beijing and other places, we don't want to present China as this monolith, all like evil, like vast empire or imperial structure. There are so many Chinese, Han Chinese intellectuals, artists, farmers, workers fighting to get representative, or if not like a Western style democracy, there's no one size fit all democracy. People always adapt, what is what is best, in response to their cultures and civilizations and histories. And so like there's no such thing as like people copycatting like someone else's democracy. We always adapt, and we are not children. We cannot be spoon fed, and we cook what curry we want to eat. And so the people of Southeast Asia, let's just say like 550 million, and looking to Taiwan, looking to Hong Kong people, looking to like South Koreans, and we are forming People's Democratic Alliance, and in that alliance, an oppositional force, that compel us to work together beyond values is China, and the Chinese Democrats need to know they have brothers and sisters across Southeast Asia, right? And that we are not opposed to Han Chinese as people. Everybody loves their country. Han loves China, that's no question. But we are opposed to their totalitarian and economically predatory system of government that wants to swallow other societies in the neighborhood. If you look at the cartoons that are so popular with the Burmese imagination, it's like, Great Wall, engulfing, half of Burma. You see what I mean? So I don't think it is helpful for any ruling party in China to alienate 550 million people across Southeast Asia, who will form a serious opposition And then no imperial power is invincible, and history has buried one empire after another. I mean, as you know, like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States had a perfect opportunity to reconfigure a new global governance, unburdened by the need for containment. The Americans could have pursued, as opposed to Cold War triumphalist, this jubilation. They could have pursued a humanistic vision. We would be living in a different type of world, as opposed to like a world that's threatened by China, a world that's threatened by the declining liberal democratic values in European Union and USA. But I mean, like while I'm on this, Biden recently gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference that's financed and sponsored by German foreign ministry, basically government, right? And he said, like, we can no longer pursue just like, hardcore interest alone. We are a value-based community. I think like, Burma and Cambodia and Southeast Asia, that where like people are threatened by the expansionist Communist Party of China. This is where he needs to, or Biden, President Biden needs to put his money where his mouth is. Yeah. And he said, like, I quote, like, we have to defend democracy. Well, democratic aspirations are under assault or under imminent threat of being crushed. And the United States need to take concrete actions in coordination with the European Union democratic community.
I would throw in I'll let you go first, Didi. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, it's so interesting. I see this very starkly in Europe now too, particularly in Germany, where I am, this problem of interests and values not coinciding, not meeting. And it's always a huge problem. And I think that at some point it seems like a superficial problem. Oh, well, it'll be fine, etc., which it never is. But that's the theory. But I wonder whether people are beginning to understand how organically, holistically, these issues are actually connected, and that if you cannot get interests and values to coincide, to meet, to work together, then you end up in a really terrible mess. And I think that we might be approaching something like that. So I agree, Zani, with what you say there. And I think that what Biden said in Munich did also highlight that. And I think it is being taken on board to some extent in Germany. I think it's beginning, that process is perhaps beginning. But I would a little bit push back on what you said about the US earlier, not to excuse anything which can't be excused. But I think that to some extent, there were a lot of people in the US who thought that they were pursuing a so-called humanistic agenda with China, by engaging with it on terms where they really looked away from a lot of stuff. I mean, the amount of the things that have happened, the stories, the this, that, and the other, because the US thought that it was sort of top dog, right? That inevitably it's a normative power. Inevitably, China will change, and it's true. How many great people there are there? How many Democrats? And I reported on all of this for years about this person, this lawyer, this feminist, all kinds of people trying to effect real change toward that kind of modern democratic, if you like, concept of a state which is not a rapacious state, where power does not have to endlessly move outward and kind of like absorb everything in order to survive at home, which is exactly what we're seeing with the CCP. It is so brittle and so threatened, essentially, that it has to keep moving out to survive. And I think that's sort of the question of interests and values. I think that is really one that Westerners now need to more closely pursue. I completely agree. And Burma, hence my comment earlier about whether or not Burma would be a kind of a point where this starts to become just blindingly obvious to everyone, but perhaps I'm overly optimistic.
I think ultimately, I mean, to bring it to the simplest level, is that if we're going to have Southeast Asia and other places have real democracies that are going to work for the population, then we're either going to have change with the Chinese government and their perspective and how they deal with other countries, or we're going to also have to have, as you mentioned with Biden, we'll have to have genuine change in the U.S. in their way they deal with the world, because the U.S. hasn't been a good player oftentimes. They have, done things in their own interests. They have not always engaged. Well, oftentimes they have not engaged with genuine democratic societies. So if the U.S. wants to, for whatever reason, if they want to stymie China and they want to do it, the best way to do it is through promoting genuine democracy in Southeast Asia. It's only going to happen when they have genuinely live up to their values and how they relate to other countries. So one of those two things has to happen if you're going to have Southeast Asia safe, the people well off. Have genuine democracy.
And just to pick up on that point directly, it's funny because there's much wrong on both sides, absolutely. And yet, when, the question is, one should always ask, where do people choose to educate their children? Where do they choose to buy a house? Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you from years and years and years in China that people are still, on balance, choosing the US. It's very much a question of the lesser of two evils. And
we teach the right values. We don't practice them.
Yeah, that's why just one brief comment. People use the word hegemony and hegemonic, when it comes to USA, and justifiably so, because as we all know, the word hegemony, and hegemonic has a degree of something being naturally desirable, right? There is a in a somewhat like a twisted way, is something positive about being hegemonic, right? So something desired, because it seems to resonate. It may not be exactly what should be desired, but at least it resonates with those on the receiving end of the impact of hegemonic power. But in sharp contrast, China is not hegemonic at all. The idea of being a hegemonic power is that the weaker ones find you attractive. You see what I mean? And there's a degree of acceptability. You want, and in other words, in a more like a shallow international relations term, the so-called soft power, like coined by Joseph Nye, formerly of Harvard Kennedy School. China does not have soft power. Its language is so damn difficult, and it is not English. Secondly, the way China does things so transparently, nakedly brutal and brutish. Yeah. And I've worked with the Chinese diplomats in Washington, D.C. when I was trying to burst American sanctions. I've worked with the U.S. State Department for years. There's qualitative difference between the two sets of interaction. I couldn't simply bring Chinese Democrats to discuss humanistic values or or freedom. Yeah. And that is why I think if I know there are choices that are not really choices. I don't want to choose between the American style soft imperialism couched in humanistic democratic discourse, and the Chinese Communist parties this bogus shared destiny. We know that there is no shared destiny with a massively expansionistic, brutal, imperialist China. Yeah, and in Vietnam at the ASEAN summit, I think the Chinese foreign minister, I believe that Wang Yi, who made it, unveiled threat to even a Singaporean foreign minister. Singapore and China used to have a really close time, right? And then more recently, last fall, when Chinese ministers stopped in Berlin, he made a threat to I think maybe Czech Republic against Czech Republic for taking a stance against CPC on I think like the Uyghur or some other issues. Yeah, and the German foreign minister felt compelled to step in and say, we don't do threats in Europe. Yeah, and then so what I'm trying to say is that if I have to, as an Asian and Southeast Asian and a Burmese, if I have to choose between two imperialist powers, I'll go with the imperialist power that at least have humanistic ears and listen. Maybe not, live up to the values fully, but at least there's some attraction with a white man who talks democracy. Yeah, at least like deliver halfway democracy or support, as opposed to totalitarian China that wouldn't even talk about democracy, let alone support democracy.
Yeah, Zani, because what's so interesting about the fact that Heiko Maas did indeed protest at Wang Yi's threats toward Czech Republic. However, unfortunately, it didn't have much impact on, big business in Germany, on Germany Inc., on all that money. And in fact, we then saw the comprehensive agreement on investment signed December 30th. And in fact, just a deepening of all those ties. Now, I know that, in some ways, Kai may have functioned to get America's attention. Europe is unhappy with some aspects of America. I get that. And maybe in some ways it wasn't as massive a deal as it perhaps is, if you like. I mean, what I'm saying is I can see both sides of that argument, but at the same time, there's no question but that German investment is flowing very, very heavily still toward China. So we have BASF and their 10 billion euro investment in Zhanjiang down south, which is of course the headquarters of the South China Fleet. This is a very important point. We have, Volkswagen. We have with all the companies, name them, and they're there. And electric vehicle, automated, autonomous driving, all these issues which are so technologically interconnected, connected to power. And China has very, very, very fine minds at work on figuring all of this out. How does that translate into raw power? How does that translate into control, into social control, into economic control, into ideological control? And I think, a lot of this has to do with that system, with that inheritance of sort of materialistic, Marxist, deterministic thinking. And I think it's a very interesting tradition, Marxism. Certainly what we see coming out of it in China now, when you add on these incredible ability there for systems engineering thinking, seeing people as parts of a machine, if you like. And then, the best example there is the one-child policy, which was in fact designed by a systems engineer, literally by a rocket scientist, called Sung Jian, which caused enormous human suffering. I guess this is getting back to the point, if you like, about where the economy of the West, of the developed industrial nations, is going, and how it's still supporting all of this political activity that we're seeing growing from China now, and what we're going to do about that. Because, Lenin said very famously that we will sell capitalists the rope with which they hang themselves. And I do think about that phrase a lot these days, because it does seem to be very much the case. Wonder what you think of that.
Well, I mean, like, we should look at the process of reinventing China, right? From the half-starving, communist China under Mao, because of the agricultural policy failures and all that, and then like internal repression. And Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger brought China from coal, not as another a big civilization or political system with shared or similar value. I mean, like quite the opposite. I mean, the Americans brought China out because, basically to weaken, the Soviet Russia, right? And out of this, like an enemy's enemy is friend kind of like historical falsity. Yeah. And I mean, in Washington D.C., like a couple of years ago, I stayed at this Mayflower Hotel, where the Chinese delegation, the ping pong delegation, was put up. There's a historic flag where they play ping pong. The room they play ping pong. Walking to the breakfast, I saw the plaque and I stopped and read it, and then you realize that the capitalist China with the totalitarian system, was really the invention or the creation of the West, because the West pursued its, unfettered greed and narrow-minded strategic interest. So they've created this Frankenstein out of a neo-totalitarian or totalitarian system. Yeah. If you look at San Francisco, Vancouver, anywhere, Toronto, Montreal, I mean, who is buying up prime properties? Who is, stashing, billions of dollars of stolen wealth from the Chinese people? You see what I mean? I mean, China still has like 500 million people in poverty. That's massive. That's 10 times the size of the United Kingdom, right? So not everyone's like, carrying Gucci bags from like Champs-Élysées, among the Chinese Communist Party children. And so I think if what you say is right, if the West, talks of democracy and holding, trying to like align interest and value, because as Mike said, the best defense against totalitarianism is support for democracy and further expansion of democratic societies and democratic sphere around the world. And if you are putting, what we call if you are like basically nurturing the poison ivy, because it serves your short-term quarterly corporate interest, then you're guilty. You know what I mean? That's a situation we are in. I mean, you can't call that country, semi-genocidal or organ, harvesting, or like, totalitarian towards its own people, and yet go and, keep corporate headquarters in Beijing or Shanghai or Wuhan or wherever. But I mean, the Western democracies or any democracy, the leaders of these democratic countries need to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah,
and
that's
they
going to
have
be
to
really
lift the
difficult.
value, or otherwise like we will all be overwhelmed by Putin's Russia that sends the FSB agents around to poison dissidents and anyone they don't like. I mean, in 2021, this isn't like a Tsarist Russia, or this isn't like a Soviet Russia with the KGB.
Right. I mean, when you look at the money that's in Silicon Valley, when you look at the money that's in Wall Street, absolutely. I mean, these are not, for want of a better word, American. They're not American companies per se, if you like. I mean, this is a certain type of globalism, and China plays that game incredibly well. Very, very good at business, very good at just capitalism. I mean, merchant thinking, exchanging, trading, brilliant. So yeah, it's going to throw it back at the so-called democratic West to come up with solutions. I think that for itself, and I think that the bit that really worries me is that, first of all, in the so-called democratic West, we have very few kind of people who really have good ethnographic knowledge of many of these places that we're talking about, China, Southeast Asia. And of course, there are lots and lots of people who are from there, such as yourself, Zani. And honestly, I would count myself there too. And I'm sure, Mike, you know that area super well. But there are far too many people in administration, in policy, in all kinds of areas who really don't have that kind of background. And they really are just looking at this very much from the outside. And I'm concerned about the quality of any kind of advice or analysis that or how we're going to manage this situation with that being the case. That's just one aspect of it, I guess. Yeah,
Mike, I think like I want to throw one thing at you. I mean, invite your response. It seems to me that when we say capitalist democracy, with the emphasis on capitalism and capitalist systems of wealth creation, which is like, to say poverty creation. Wealth doesn't come out of a sky. Some people have to be poor for others to be rich. That's very simple, right? It isn't simply a matter of like a redistributing wealth. Even the creation of the wealth itself produces poverty. Yeah, and I wonder what we are seeing globally, on a large scale, on a big scale, is the compatibility of capitalist economies and totalitarian style of government. Yeah, and then like democracy becomes a nuisance, an obstacle, for both camps. Apparently, the corporate structures are not democratic. The CEOs made the decision. If they screwed up, they get fired by the board, but not by the shareholders, right? And so, we've got this like on one hand, Western capitalism with veneer of democratic processes. On the other hand, we've got like similarly capitalistic economy in China with a solid totalitarian shell or structure, right? So what we are seeing is two cores of two different types of civilizations, if you will, working hand in glove, sharing the spoils, right? The top echelons of the Chinese communist parties and 1% in Western democratic societies, they're all friends. Yeah, it's just us, like the little people who struggle to make ends meet. We are offered this democratic discourse on the ground, and in China they offer patriotism and developmentalism, right? And then so I wonder what if we are not grasping the real essence of what is driving this world order.
Right, which is why left and right is becoming less meaningful and interesting, I think, in how we frame our thinking. A very brief example there. Some of you you'll probably all know that this recent push for Chinese money to take over in education. I mean, there's just been some stuff in the UK about it in schools. Same thing's happening here in Germany. It hasn't really been uncovered here yet. And what's so interesting is that this very much comes in the language of, the internationalization of education according to high liberal standards. Some of it's coming through the same vehicles as this kind of education has arrived, for example, around the world through these very top schools that then sort of franchise themselves elsewhere. And in a sense, you just need to pour money back into it and then come at the system from China. And then it's sort of married and invest and create these places in Germany, in the UK, elsewhere in the world. But it's because it's China, it's married with this language about how this is about the sinification of international education, quote unquote, and how it's going to implement Xi Jinping thought, etc. And, so yeah, I agree. There is this sort of sense that it's all the same, but I think that ultimately we're going to have to be very careful about seeing that it's kind of not all the same, and that, the values are really what is the really thing that's going to drive this and differentiate between the systems, and see what are the chances of China ever kind of joining the so-called modern world in that sense. I think that's really a big question. And I wonder how the military there comes into it, Mike, how you see these processes shaping military reactions. That's your wheelhouse.
No, I think I mentioned before that that when, regardless of who's in power, the military or civilian democracy and civilian leaders in Burma, they all wind up warming up to China because they're right on China's front back door. Actually, it just always reminds me of what Ho Chi Minh said, because right after Indochina was liberated from Japanese occupation, the northern half was occupied by the Kuomintang, and the southern half by the French colonial rulers. And the idea was you want to get the French out, but Ho Chi Minh made a deal to bring the French into northern Vietnam. Why would you want to bring the colonizers back in? And he said because the French, he said something much more vulgar, which I won't repeat here, but he said something to the fact that the French will only stay for a couple of years. The Chinese, if they come, they'll stay here forever. And so that's always going to be a factor. It doesn't really, the military, if anything, I don't want to say that right now because of the current circumstances, but if anything, the military is often glorified in the fact that it repulsed Chinese invasions in different Southeast Asian countries. But glorifying in victories of the past does not seem to warrant against taking bribes and benefiting from corruption and that kind of thing. So I think that until we actually have genuine democracy, we're not going to have a fixed anything. The civilian authoritarian governments you get are going to be pro-China. The military governments you're going to get are going to be pro-China. You really have to have the general popular voice. And this is where capitalism comes in. This genuinely interested in the betterment of the people and recognizes that, being completely economically integrated into China and actually being a periphery and serving as both a market and a source of raw supplies and agricultural surplus, that's just a colonial relationship. That's a dependency relationship. That was Latin America, in the 1960s, 1970s. That's not any kind of freedom.
Yeah, that's why I think, before we wrap up, that's why I think, the Burmese call this, we don't call this Burmese spring because we only have 3 seasons and we don't have spring. So we call it early summer. Usually summer arrives around, the second week of March. So people are calling this uprising, a nationwide, as a Nue U Tolanye, or the early, the arrival of basically early summer revolution. And Mike, I totally agree. I think what we are seeing actually, whatever happens in the immediate term, the 2 things very clear. The Burmese are not going to allow the military to be put back under the military boot, not the old style, not anymore. Yeah, that we're looking at a radically different society. This society no longer is afraid of bullets, whether it's rubber or real. They, yesterday they killed 2 people. You see millions out today. Yeah, and then the Burmese military brought, light infantry divisions that were used to commit genocide and other sorts of, atrocity crimes against other minorities in other parts of the country. And the people know. I mean, there's strength in numbers. I mean, you've got one whole society. And also the second point, I think we are not looking at simply a political uprising. I mean, this is the Burmese equivalent of Black Lives Matter. There is a fundamental shift in the social consciousness. Yeah, when you see signs, majority people, in bold red and white letters, saying sorry to the Rohingyas, sorry to the minorities, and also gay, lesbian, queer, everybody. So this is essentially, a cultural revolution without the Politburo. There's a revolution going on, and maybe political objectives may not be achieved without the serious international intervention. Yeah, to push the Burmese military to reverse the coup. But in terms of social revolution, it's moving on. Anything that stands is going to be pushed out, and weeded out. And so there's a new consciousness where the people want inclusive, multicultural, empathetic society. Yeah, and so without which we cannot have a technical democracy. What we have had is a limited technical democracy, between Aung San Suu Kyi's popular NLD and the military-backed party.
But
we've got, the society has gone beyond that.
What you actually had was a colonial diarchy. That's what you had with Aung San Suu Kyi in the military. You didn't have a democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how China reacts to what you described, Zani, because, this change, because of course for China, it's very threatening. They've certainly got their own pressures of the same kind at home, this upward pressure from the people to establish all these things. We've seen it again and again. And, they're very, very good at stopping it. We saw that in Tiananmen very clearly. It was a long time ago, and it's just been constant ever since. All the time, all the time, all the time. You see just stuff happening, people being stopped, human rights problems, and they're all aimed at stopping precisely this kind of movement. Of course, why is Hong Kong being treated so harshly right now? Is obviously because of the massive democracy demonstrations, which were asking for exactly the same thing. So I think it'll be interesting to watch and see to what extent China reacts to this particular, exactly what you're describing in Myanmar today. To how far do they dare to go?
Well, I mean, they have obviously provided, surveillance support, all kinds of support, so one thing we don't talk about is Russia. Like the Burmese are also, not putting their eggs in a single Chinese basket. They have calibrated, how far they want to get close to China. They're using Japan, Russia, India as counterbalancing forces, and maybe not, as forceful or powerful as the China is in Burma, but nonetheless, those are, basically countervailing factors that the Burmese military is using, and that's why, it becomes quite difficult for the democratization from below to actually push the military out without other states coming to the side of the people in a concrete way. What we're seeing is that authoritarian regimes can really count on one another in very concrete strategic means, whether in the form of veto power or arms shipment or financial support or diplomatic covers, right? But when it comes to people, anywhere in the world, people do not have real states that they can call their friends, in times of their democratic needs. That's what we are seeing. I mean, this is 3 weeks. All these demonstrations have been going on. People risking their lives and livelihoods, not just lives, families, the food and shelter and all kinds of things. We are not seeing anything concrete from European Union or United Kingdom or the U.S. is the only one that is basically doing the heavy lifting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe we've probably gone over the topic pretty thoroughly for one sitting. Thanks for joining me. I didn't, because of the technological chaos at the beginning, I didn't actually introduce all of us. So I'm Mike Charney, and with me is Dr. Maung Zarni and Didi Kirsten Tatlow. Did I pronounce it correctly?
You did, thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks. This has been a very interesting and long conversation.
Yeah, thanks,
and we covered all
everyone.
the issues at hand. Thanks for joining.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Take care.
Mike. Thanks,
Bye.
Didi.
Thanks,
Okay,
Mike.
bye-bye
Thanks,
now.
Annie.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.